Welcome everybody this afternoon to the first Hanover seminar lecture series. And today we have a real treat. We have two of the department's stellar PhD candidates going to give presentations on two somewhat related topics that I think are really fascinating, because in my own work, the idea of forest restoration or forest regeneration is becoming probably the hottest topic in climate change mitigation and adaptation around the world. It's really gathering a lot of interest as a solution, one of the solution sets for sequestering carbon and mitigating climate change. So both of these presentations kind of relate to that, so I'm totally interested in this. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce these speakers. We're going to start out with Claire Esch, who was one of Dr. Coley's graduate students, and she's going to give us a presentation on Acacia restoration. And this is also kind of interesting because Acacia is like one of these species that is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. There's hundreds and hundreds of species, from the flat-top acacias in the famous savannas of Africa to timber-grade acacias that are being used to plant reforestation projects in Vietnam. All these places that I work, I see acacia, acacia, acacia all the time. So this is going to be an interesting presentation. And Claire is a BS in horticulture from Western Kentucky University. Now she's here at MSU in our department, so we're glad to have her. I'll introduce our second speaker, which is Katherine Henry, who will also be talking about forest regeneration in temperate hardwoods. And I'll introduce her separately. So each have about 20-25 minutes to split the hour between you. So, Clarice, it's all yours.
Thank you. Yep, so today I'll be talking about the work that I spent 6 months in Hawaii doing on evaluating Acacia koa as a restoration tool. So to start off, I just wanted to acknowledge a few folks and give a bit of an explanation about how I ended up in Hawaii for 6 months. So I was there via the NSF GRIP program, which is the Graduate Research Internship Program. It allows grad students to work with scientists at federal agencies. So I was at USGS's Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center, which is based in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. There I was working with Dr. Stephanie Yelnick, and the work that I'm presenting to you today builds off of her work. And I also got to work with a great group of people that I'd like to thank. That first name there, Ali Trejan, she's actually an MSU forestry alum. So getting into Acacia koa, commonly called koa, this species is a Hawaiian endemic. It's common throughout the forests on all of the Hawaiian islands. And then in the 1850s, there was an influx of cattle ranching. So a lot of Hawaii's forests were cut down and replaced with exotic pasture grasses for forage. In more recent decades, cattle ranching has declined, and now there's this opportunity to reforest these spaces of exotic grass pasture. So koa is quite an appealing species for restoration work. Here on the right side, we have a sapling that I got to plant while I was in Hawaii. It's appealing because it is fast growing. It's also easy to propagate. It's easy to grow from seeds. It also readily produces suckers in the field. It's in the lichen family, so it fixes nitrogen. So this means that it can contribute nitrogen to the soil, and that nitrogen can benefit the growth of plants around. Being a fast grower, it readily forms a closed canopy in about 10 to 20 years. And this is important for restoration work because once you have that closed canopy, you have a structure that birds will come to, they'll disperse seeds, and then you'll have other species coming into the understory underneath your koa trees, and you'll be on your way towards restoring a diverse forest. But what's not clear is if koa is overcoming all of the barriers to restoration that it needs to be effective. So one of the major barriers to restoration in Hawaiian forests are these persistent pasture grasses. So one of the common grasses is kikuyu grass, which is up in that right-hand picture to give an illustration of how dense it can be. It's rhizomatous. It forms these incredible mats that are great to sit and eat your lunch in, but it's not great for any woody species that's trying to grow up through it. Competing with that grass is near impossible. So when we're moving from cattle pastures into areas where we've planted koa, there's this expectation that once we have a closed canopy, grasses will be suppressed underneath. So underneath that canopy, there's enough shade, and then there's also litter falling that will physically suppress the grasses beneath these koa trees. Based on Stephanie, who is working with the USGS, her work at Hakalau, she's finding that grasses aren't being suppressed underneath koa trees. This is actually a picture of koa planted at Hakalau, and we're seeing ever-present grasses there. And this might be because there's not enough shade cast by those koa trees. They're pretty widely spaced. Maybe it's the nitrogen that they're fixing and contributing to those grasses, and it's allowing them to grow. Or the conditions of Hakalau are pretty mesic. It's really wet, so maybe decomposition is happening so quickly that you're not getting that litter layer that would be suppressing the grasses. Whatever it may be, what's clear is that in these conditions at Hakalau, with these widely spaced trees and fairly wet conditions, we're just getting koa and grass. So where I come in is to ask, so under what conditions can koa effectively suppress grasses? Are there things that we can shift or certain sites where we might expect koa to do a better job at suppressing grasses? So as we thought about this, it's important to think about all the pieces happening in this interaction. So first, with light availability, with any tree growing up, it's casting shade underneath, and most grasses are shade intolerant. So via this shade cast by the tree, the grass growth should be diminished. What's interesting about koa is that it forms two types of leaves. So at the bottom of that sapling, you see compound leaves that you normally think of with acacias, and those are the true leaves. And then at the top of that sapling, you see phyllodes, which are expanded petioles, and they're more sickle-shaped. And one of the things that distinguishes these leaves is that the true leaves have photosynthetic material only on the top, so they're oriented more horizontally to catch the sun's rays. Whereas phyllodes have photosynthetic material on both sides, so they orient more vertically to catch sunlight on both sides. Most adult koa trees have canopies full of phyllodes, so they're full of these leaves that are oriented more vertically rather than horizontally, so they're not casting as much shade. And then if we start thinking about these leaves falling and creating a layer on the ground and creating a physical barrier for grass growth and establishment, of course when you have more trees, you'll have more litter coming in and creating that layer, but it's also important to think about decomposition of that litter. So how long is that litter sticking around and actually accumulating? And one of the important parts about this decomposition is also that koa, being a nitrogen fixer, produces leaves that are rich in nitrogen. So as it decomposes, it's contributing nitrogen to the soil, and then this nitrogen can feed the growth of grasses around koa trees. And additionally, the nitrogen fixation process within the tree itself is a bit leaky. So there's the root nodules where nitrogen fixation is happening. Most of the N goes into the tree, but some of it leaks out. So we have some N inputs direct from the root system as well. So what we have here with all of these interactions is we have koa canopies that aren't casting a lot of shade. We do have litter falling that could be suppressing grasses. But if we're in a site where decomposition is happening quickly, then that litter layer is not building up. We have N coming into the system, feeding the grasses. So as we're thinking about all of these interactions and what do we have variation in that we can look at that might shift the balance from having this state of koa and grass coexisting to koa suppressing grasses, we thought about density. So our first hypothesis relates to koa density, that as you move from areas of low density koa to high density koa, we would see less light coming through, more koa litter, and that this would lead to less grass growth. And then our second hypothesis relates to rainfall. So we expected that as you have less rain, so you're at a drier site, you have slower decomposition, and then if those leaves are turning over more slowly, you have slower rates of N coming into the system, and you also have more accumulation of a litter layer, and this would lead to less grass growth. So to put our hypotheses to the test, we went to 5 different sites across the Big Island, And starting in the north, moving clockwise, those are Hakalau, Halinapali, Kukuku, Konahema, and Pu'uwa'awa. You'll notice that there's rainfall paired with each of those points on the map. That's the average annual rainfall, and we were interested in having that rainfall gradient for our second hypothesis. Also, some of the sites themselves encompassed a bit of a rainfall gradient, so we would have multiple sets of plots within a given site to catch those ends of the gradient. So each set of plots included 5 areas of high-density koa, 5 areas of low-density koa, and then 5 controls with no koa, just grass. We targeted areas that were predominantly koa and grass, rather than getting other species mixed in there, because we were really interested in what's happening in this koa-grass interaction. So each plot was a circular plot with a 2.5 meter radius, where we measured all of the koa stems. We also looked at grass and litter biomass. We measured litter fall rate, litter decomposition, percent cover of koa litter and grass. We also looked at percent composition of those grasses. We recorded light levels. We measured soil moisture at 3 different time points and quantified plant available soil nitrogen in the forms of nitrate and ammonium. And before I get into the results, I'll note that the fieldwork for this was finished up a month ago, so the analyses that you're seeing are preliminary, but very suggestive and indicative of what we're seeing. So to begin, looking at light availability, we have less light with more koa stems. On our figure, on our x-axis, we have stem count, and then on the y-axis, we have percent full sun. The blue dots are low-density plots, and the green dots are for areas of high densities of koa. And you can see the general trend with more stems. We have less light coming through. There's also a whole lot of variation happening in there. And this red dotted line at the bottom is an important threshold. So other work in Hawaii has shown that only when you get beneath 5% full sun are you actually suppressing grasses. And as you can see in these plots, there's very few instances where we're actually coming below that 5% threshold. So we're not consistently coming to a place where we're suppressing those pasture grasses based on shading alone. So then if we look at percent cover, so the way we did percent cover is we went into the field with a stake, placed it on the ground, and looked at the first thing that it hit, and that's our main layer, which is those top 3 box plots. And then we looked at what was underneath that main layer as well, and that will be the bottom 3 plots. So on our y-axis, we have percent cover. Those 3 panels moving from left to right are the control plots, the low-density plots, and the high-density plots. Each bar is associated with the site. The green parts of the bar are for grass cover, the brown parts of the bar are for koa litter. If we look at our control plots, we have mostly grass, which is what we were targeting. In our low-density koa plots, we again are encountering mostly grass, and in the high-density koa plots, we're still seeing mostly grass. We have a few sites. There are actually multiple sets of sites at Kahuku where we are seeing some more koa litter coming in, but it's predominantly grass. So now if we look at what's happening underneath all of that grass, at our control sites, we're still seeing mostly grass. There's a bit of koa litter coming in because these are grassy plots within the matrix of a koa forest. Then when we have areas of low density koa, we're seeing more koa litter come in, and then as we have high density koa plots, we have even more koa litter coming in. So we are seeing things that meet our expectations, that we have more koa litter with more koa stems, but this is happening underneath that layer of grass. So these increased volumes of koa litter are not actually suppressing that grass very much. So then if we look at how many stems does it take for koa litter to dominate, we're back at the main layer, the first thing that we saw when we went out into the field. We have stem count on our x-axis and koa litter on our y-axis. We can see that it's right around 15 to 20 stems within these plots that we actually see substantial amounts of koa litter, but there's still a lot of variation in there. And then if we look at what's happening underneath that, the graph with the same axes, we're seeing, again, it's around 15 to 20 stems that we're finally hitting full coverage of koa litter underneath all of that grass. But it's important to pair this with the percent cover data that's telling us that we still have that grass overtopping all of this koa litter that is still coming in. And then if we look at biomass, so I went into to the field into each plot, dropped a quadrat, cut out everything from that, and dried it in the oven and sorted it out. Here we look at the left panel where we have oven-dried grass biomass on our y-axis, and on our x-axis we have plot density, moving from left to right with control, low and high density. We do see that we have less grass biomass in our plots with more koa stems. And then if we move to the panel on the right where we're looking at the koa leaves, we do have more koa leaves coming in where we have more koa stems. So again, lining up with our expectations, but it's just important to remember that even though we're getting these larger volumes of leaves coming in, the grasses aren't being suppressed, they're still overtopping this layer of koa litter. So then if we go on to decomposition, so if we go back to that second hypothesis where we were expecting that with less rain at our drier sites, we would have slower decomposition, we'd accumulate a litter layer, and that could suppress grasses. So to look at decomposition, we tied together a lot of koa leaves with fishing line, which here we have koa leaves that I've pulled out from under a layer of grass. So those leaves were buried in each of the plots underneath the layer of grass or the layer of koa litter. And then each month for 4 months I went out and I retrieved a string of leaves to look at how much they had decomposed. So if we look at the amount of mass that's still remaining in our box plots, so on our x-axis we have plot density going from control low and high from left to right, and then on the y-axis we have the proportion of the leaf mass that's still remaining. Each color of the box corresponds to the different months, and as you can see with time, we're losing leaf mass, the leaves are decomposing, but then if you compare what's happening at each plot density, we're seeing faster decomposition at higher densities of koa. Here I'm showing you panels from just 2 of the sites. It's consistent across all of the sites. We're seeing this pattern of faster leaf decomposition with higher koa densities. So when we were thinking about these relationships, we hadn't thought about how koa density might affect decomposition. Our thoughts are that it might be related to soil nitrogen. So where there are more koa stems, we expect that there would be more nitrogen in the soil. And based on the literature, in plots with higher nitrogen, you do have faster decomposition. So that might be what's driving our pattern here. And then if we keep thinking about our second hypothesis and decomposition and how it relates to site moisture, here we have soil moisture on our x-axis, and we plotted it against the proportion of leaf mass remaining and all the different colors of the sites. But what's important here is that there's a cloud of points. There's no relationship that we're finding between soil moisture and decomposition. And then if we move to the panel on the right side where we have rainfall for each of these sites in millimeters on our x-axis, once again, we're not seeing consistent relationships or any direction in terms of decomposition and the amount of rainfall that we're getting at these sites. So our second hypothesis was really getting at this idea that maybe at drier sites you would have slower decomposition and accumulate a litter layer, and we were trying to hone in on conditions under which koa might be suppressing grasses, and based on this, moisture isn't one of those determining factors that we could use to try to find those site conditions. So our findings so far, when we look at areas with high density of koa stems, we're seeing more koa litter coming in and less grass there based on both the percent cover and biomass data, which lines up with our expectations, but it's also important to remember those 2 layers of the percent cover data and that the koa litter is being overtopped by the grasses, so it's not actually suppressing them. And at the same time, in these areas where we have lots of koa stems, we have more litter coming in. That litter is decomposing faster. So where we might be accumulating a litter layer, it's actually going away faster. So that might mean that nitrogen is coming to the system faster and we're having less accumulation of litter. We also found no relationship between soil moisture or rainfall and decomposition rates. And we did find less light with more koa stems, but we weren't getting beneath that 5% full sun threshold that was needed to actually reduce grass growth. So if we put it all together and come back out to that question of can COA effectively suppress grasses, we've seen that when it comes to light availability, yes, it casts shade, but not enough shade to suppress the grasses. And there are more COA leaves falling as we have more COA trees, but in those situations it's decomposing faster, so we're not coming up with conditions where COA might actually be suppressing grasses. There's a few factors remaining. I have the lab work left to do to get at those nitrogen inputs in the system, and ultimately I'd like to put everything together in a structural equation model to be able to get some of those pathways and the interactions here. But when we think about is COA an effective tool for restoration, if you'd like to restore anything other than COA and grass, it might be useful to plant other species in your mix so that you can have grass suppression and give other species a chance to naturally recruit into the system. And with that, thank you for your time. Any questions?
So we have 5 minutes for questions.
So in the high density plots or even the low density plots, were you seeing signs of regeneration of the COA?
Of the COA will grow back, mostly
Okay.
from suckers from those trees that are already established.
Okay, so it's not, it will still outcompete the grass?
Yes, because it's a sucker from
Okay.
another tree, yeah. But on its own, in the quadrants where I cut everything out, I did see a few seeds sprout and grow about that big, and then the grass over top.
Okay.
Kind of saw it in action. Yeah.
One question, because I walked in a little bit late. Are the grasses invasive? Are they non-native invasive?
Yeah, they're exotic grasses that
Okay.
are grown for cattle.
Okay, so then I have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Do those grasses, where they are native, interact with acacia species, and how do they behave there? And secondly, the other question, which is not totally related, if there is a COA forest of 5% sunlight availability, is that a desirable forest? Do people like that?
Okay, so first question, kikuyu, one of the dominant exotic grasses, is an African grass where there are acacias as well, but out of my realm of expertise, but that's a really interesting question. And then when it comes to like having a forest that's shaded, the forests around here, like bigger woodland, is less than 5%.
But of COA?
Of COA.
Or is that what kind of forest? It could be a mixed forest as long as it's only 5%. Or because you were talking about a 5%.
Right.
Sunlight.
Yeah, that threshold.
Is that only a COA forest, or is that like any kind of?
Yeah, it could be. That's just the light level we need to get to actually suppress the grasses.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing speedy analysis you did. Pretty cool. A couple questions, I guess. So, are there specific mixes that you thought of that you could do with acacia? I mean, you mentioned you can mix it with other species, but do you have like suggestions for restoration that are more explicit, I guess?
Yeah, it's kind of a sticky situation because like being an island system, there's not a lot of species to choose from, and these forests were dominated by koa and ohia, Psittaros polymorpha, and ohia grows incredibly slowly, so everyone wants to plant it, but there's just not enough growers for it actually. There's other understory tree species that could be added into the mix, but in terms of canopy dominance, these are the big ones.
With those understory trees, you just increase the leaf area index and you'd be all set with your 5% probably, right?
Yeah.
Follow that up a little bit. So, in the hypotheses that you have, it seems like there's another hybrid, kind of a hybrid, a little bit,
Yeah.
that might be worthy of exploring, and that is that might you expect that acacia would carry higher leaf area index and higher rainfall, and thus that if normalized for density, it would cast higher shade to the understory, such that it might be at least partially effective in higher rainfall areas. It seems like you have the data to look at that.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that at all. It's a great point.
I think that's what you'd expect at least. maybe a cedar beam.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, Kim, I think I'm following up on your Mike's question. Do you think it's possible in those Hawaiian native forests to get to 5% light level with the leaf display of those Ohia and the koa? I mean, I definitely can't imagine it with Ohia, the way, with that those clumped leaves and the way the browns are.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, because grasses are definitely invading intact forests as they are, which is super important. So maybe, so the 5% threshold comes from an experiment with shade plots. So
Yeah.
Maybe we can actually get to it with vegetation. I'm not sure. It's a great point.
All right. Thanks, Clarice. That was great. So while Catherine's getting her presentation ready, let me do a quick introduction. The next speaker is Katherine Henry, and she's a fourth-year PhD student in Dr. Walter's laboratory, and she'll be talking to us today on regeneration dynamics in managed northern hardwood forests. So again, we're kind of continuing that theme of restoration and regeneration, and when I look at it, I see carbon sequestration written all over it. But anyway, another great presentation on its way. Take it over. Catherine, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here. So today I'm going to be presenting much of the same results that from a paper I've been working on with Dr. Mike Walters, also Dr. Amy Finley and Evan Farinosi, and this is some results that I presented at ESA this past summer. And so we're looking at the complex drivers of tree regeneration and what they might suggest about the long-term sustainability of managed northern hardwood forests here in Michigan and in the greater Great Lakes region. So a little bit of background, northern hardwood forests, they cover about 50 million hectares in the northeastern United States. And in 1957, a man named Art Gast introduced this guide to single tree selection. It's this kind of viewed as non-invasive by the public, small dispersed harvests of canopy trees as well as culling undesirable trees in the understory. And so since 1957, this has been used almost ubiquitously, especially in the Great Lakes region for northern hardwood forests. And so it produces this continuous stream of forest products, which is also seen as economically desirable. So you're removing about 30% of the volume every 10 to 15 years. And in this system, since you're only opening up these ephemeral small gaps in the canopy, you're going to be promoting a lot of shade-tolerant species such as sugar maple, which is currently in the Great Lakes region the most abundant as well as one of the most economically valuable tree species. So this was seen as very desirable. And that is the species I will be focusing on today. But under this system, and in conjunction with a lot of external drivers, we've been seeing some concerning trends in terms of the regeneration of these stands. So overall, in northern hardwood forests, which are managed as compared to unmanaged, we've seen a decline in the overall density of regeneration as well as the species diversity of this regenerative layer. And there's several reasons why we think this trend is occurring. So there's been invasive pests and pathogens. Here's a photo of an American beech tree infested with a beech bark disease. And so some of these have reduced the pool of viable canopy species, which you might expect to recruit. There is a really deep layer of litter in these northern hardwood forests from a lot of these leaves which are slow to decompose. They also often harvest in the winter when they have minimal disruption to the forest floor. So we kind of get this deep layer of litter which prohibits small seeded species from establishing. So some things like yellow birch have had difficulty in regenerating. The white-tailed deer has also been a huge problem throughout North America with really high populations, just depressing overall regeneration, eating it over the winter months especially, and they also have preferential browse, whereby they are altering the species composition. So sugar maple is one of their favorite foods, and so it's really heavily targeted by deer. And then finally, there are some people that think that the gaps that are created by single tree selection are actually just too small to recruit even sugar maple as shade tolerant as it may be. So with all these questions in mind, we have this large project going on in the lab But before I get to that, so this is a little table regarding the desired stand structure in Arbogast's guide from 1957. And so this is kind of like an idea of what stocking you may want. And under this system, we've also seen problems overall with achieving this stand structure in managed stands. So there's evidence that it's not even living up to what it's supposed to be for the canopy trees that are already existing. So I just have a few figures showing, these are our stands, which I'll get to in a minute, but kind of you can just look at the trend here for northern Michigan. So saw timber is 10 inches and above at diameter at breast height. And so if it's a black square, it is stocked stand from our data, and if it's red, it's understocked. So we're doing pretty well in trees 10 inches and above, but when you look at the pole class, which is 4 to 10 inches, we're starting to see a lot of stands which are understocked in that pole size class. And the problem gets even worse when you go to saplings, which here is just trees which are 2 to 4 inches diameter at breast height. And so this is kind of just a picture of these stands that we're dealing with, showing you that there's not only problems with the regeneration, but also the stand structure as well. So there's significant concerns to the management of northern hardwood forests, which has prompted research to explore alternative management regimes. So overall with this project, we have the driving question of how can we improve management of these managed northern hardwood stands for long-term sustainability. And that's kind of the project that we're exploring as a lab, also with Gary Roloff in the Fisheries and Wildlife Department. As a whole, we're exploring this question. But today I'm going to be addressing kind of where are we starting from, specifically in terms to regeneration. And why would I want to focus on this? Again, advanced regeneration provides insight to the future forest stand structure and composition. These stands rely on natural regeneration, and so if you don't have the regeneration, there's nothing to grow up into the canopy in the future decades. So overall, my objectives with this specific analyses are to examine patterns of sugar maple regeneration and the potential drivers of those patterns, and think about how those results can apply to management of northern hardwood forests. And all of this will be done in a flexible Bayesian framework. So again, this is kind of that figure I showed you earlier, but this is just an overall project design. We have 141 stands, and they're predominantly with the Department of Natural Resources, and we also have some industry to help fill out our sampling design. And I'll explain what these treatments are right now. So about half of the stands have a scarification. So what we're doing is we're actually dragging and overturning the dirt with skidders and all types of heavy machinery to increase the amount of bare mineral soil to hopefully promote those small seeded species to establish. And the other half of the stands, we're leaving the treetops, and this is hopefully to create physical barriers to deter deer browsing. So it's kind of like a 2x4 factorial design. So these are the 2 post-harvest treatments. And then we have 4 harvesting treatments. Again, so these stands have historically been managed under single tree selection, but we are trying out a seed tree where you have just a few trees left per acre to provide a seed source, so they're mature trees that you're leaving behind. Shelter wood, where you open the canopy up to about 50% openness. When we were marking this, you'd think every other canopy tree gets cut, basically. And so it's a higher light availability as compared to selection cuts. But still leaving a good amount of trees. Selection, so a quarter of our stands were cut kind of business as usual selection with small gaps. And then we had a group selection, which is basically like a small patch cut. So within these groups, and we modified the size, we were cutting down everything within it and varying those gap sizes to see how that might affect regeneration. So this is kind of just a plug for the project at large. I'm not going to be talking about any results after harvest. All of my stuff is about prior to harvest, what kind of patterns we're seeing, but this is some really exciting stuff, so we just wanted to share kind of what's going to be coming out of the lab. And overall, we had a really intensive sampling design, so we had those 141 stands, and they're all 30 acres in size, which is pretty large. And then we have 25 survey points within each of those stands where we have various sized quadrats and plots to measure different sized trees and also the ground layer and the herbaceous vegetation. And then we also did some deer pellet winter surveys. So basically from the time that the leaves fall to the time that you would survey in the spring, that's kind of a period of time where any pellets that are going to be on top of that leaf litter, you know, were deposited in that time, so you can get an idea of how often deer are using a site. And so we had like some line transects that we walked that we counted deer pellets on to see how often they're using our stands. So when I'm going to be modeling today the height and size classes, I kind of broke it up into 3 different layers. The seedling, which would be 0 to 50 centimeters tall, it's about your knee, so this is really that carpet of seedlings that are present. Small saplings, which are knee to breast height, and so anything in that zone is going to be at risk for being browsed by deer, so that's kind of like a deer browse pressure zone. And then larger saplings, which have achieved breast height and up to 5 centimeters DBH or 2 inches. And again, this is all going to be for sugar maple. And so within the hierarchical framework, the way that I modeled this allows me to model the different size classes of sugar maple within a given plot simultaneously, so you can also account for their effect on one another, since larger seedlings and saplings are going to have an effect on smaller size classes in terms of their density. And so I have predictor variables including canopy density, which is really a proxy for light availability, canopy richness, which might affect also light availability and also affects the seed source and the competition that it will be getting. Percent shrub coverage, so this was important only for the smaller classes. So in some cases you get these really dense thickets of rubus, which are competing with small seedlings and saplings for resources and space. Deer usage, and I'll get to that a little bit more detail in a minute. Site quality, so we have a herbaceous indicator of site quality. It's called the COTAR system. It's developed specifically for Michigan, so we can kind of rank these as low, medium, high site quality in terms of how much water and nutrients are available. And then region, within kind of the eastern Upper Peninsula, Western Upper Peninsula, and the Northern Lower Peninsula, you kind of get distinct compositions of species, and so by including region, that accounts for some variability within our sites. Another factor that we are hoping to include is year since harvest. So when was the last time these stands were entered and cut, which affects the density, and there are known patterns with regeneration responding to cuts. This data is not in the model just at the moment because we've had some troubles getting a sufficient sample size due to just difficulty in having these records that might be from 20 years ago. But that's something we're going to be looking forward with. And as I said, since it's a hierarchical framework, the larger sugar maple regeneration classes influence the smaller. So the browse sap, that saplings that are in the browse zone, their density, we explored how that affects the smaller seedling class. And deer usage, so we were able to do those deer pellet surveys prior to harvest, but we only got to a subset of sites, and so I developed a Bayesian model to be able to estimate the deer usage at all of the sites. And this model is also really useful because those data are traditionally very noisy. They're not the most perfect estimation of deer usage, but it's kind of the easiest thing to get and one of the only feasible ways in many instances. So a model can kind of help you to take out some of the noise that is just due to deer moving randomly and you not capturing their real usage. And so I developed a model for that as well. And so some of the variables are average snow depth. Deer in the winter avoid areas of deep snow because it requires more energy. The local landscape. So deciduous forest is what they use for food. As I mentioned earlier, they love sugar maple. I included mixed forest. Excuse me. And then the evergreen forest is really important for them sheltering from snowstorms and things like that in the winter, so they tend to bed in evergreen forest. And agricultural land, as deer have adapted to use agriculture and developed land for food. And so I included, I made a map basically that looks at within the 25-kilometer home range of deer. It looks at like what percentage of the landscape is those different forest types as predictors. And then we also had pellet surveys from 2019, but that was after the harvest, and we actually did see a significant effect of harvest. So I used 2019 to kind of infer what the deer pellet population might have been prior to harvest, and it accounts for what harvest treatment happened because that influenced the way that deer were using the landscape. So this deer usage is the output of my model. So this is modeled results, not the raw data. And so this is for all of the stands, the probability of deer usage, probably more so than occupancy. So if the value was a 1, like 100%, that means that we were finding pellets. Basically, we subdivided the transects into little chunks, and it was kind of we calculated how many of those chunks were occupied by deer. And so if it was 1, that means that we found deer pellets in every single transect. And if it was 0, that would mean we didn't find any deer pellets excuse me, on the site. But that didn't happen. We have deer everywhere, and it just varies in how much they use the stand. So you can see there's some areas like here in the southern western UP that are particularly high, and like lower densities up in here, and that really follows like the snow belt pattern, where they're avoiding kind of like the northern lower peninsula, or the northern upper peninsula due to the deep snow in that area. So there's some definite spatial trends to our deer model. And so what I have now is a map of the seedling densities. It's seedlings per hectare. And just a reminder, another way to think about this is if you divided it by 10,000, it would be the number of seedlings in a meter quadrant, which is oftentimes easier to think about. And so overall, these numbers are actually pretty high, and there aren't any super obvious trends spatially about where we're seeing seedlings and where we aren't. The seedlings overall looked pretty good in terms of we see enough seedlings that you'd expect to sustain a stand. And with my Bayesian model, I have my beta values from that equation. Again, these are, since it's a log-link model, these values are, you can't translate it literally from like a 1-to-1, but overall, some of the more significant ones we're seeing is that we're seeing fewer seedlings in the northern lower peninsula, slightly on average, as compared to the western UP and the eastern UP. But overall, as I said, there's not any really clear spatial patterns, which is pretty good. There's actually a slightly positive association with increased deer. But again, these all look pretty good overall. And so I'll move on to some of those larger regeneration classes, which have some more interesting results. So this is our model. This is our raw data for small saplings. So these are saplings that are at risk of being browsed. And immediately you can see from this figure that there is a much stronger spatial pattern to these data, where especially like down here, where we're seeing a lot of snow, we're seeing almost no small saplings that are being able to survive kind of that deer browse zone. Up here in the Keweenaw, they do great. We know that from speaking with managers that they're able to really recruit sugar maple up there. And so when we look at some of the model results, we're seeing more saplings in western UP, eastern UP is intermediate, and then the fewest in the northern lower peninsula. And we're seeing some interesting patterns with site quality, where high site quality as compared to intermediate site quality actually has a little bit fewer saplings, and low site quality actually had the most on average. So there might be some interesting interactions there with deer and site quality that would warrant looking into further. Another important one is that there was a really strong negative association, as we would expect with deer usage. And a common way to interpret beta values when they're with a log link is to exponentiate them. So next to the beta, I have the exponentiated beta. And the way to think about this is that if you had your predictor was 0, and then you went from 0 to 1, you increased it by 1, and it's 1 on whatever scale of your predictor. So for deer, it was 0 to 1. That is the percent difference you would predict in terms of your response. So if you had no deer, versus if you had 100% deer occupancy, they were all over the site, they were really using it heavily, you would expect a 93% decrease in the number of small saplings. So we're seeing a really strong relationship with deer. Overall, we are seeing with increasing canopy stems per plot, so increasing density, having lower light availability, we're seeing a decline in the small saplings. And then the same goes actually for richness. This one is interesting though, because I don't think it's necessarily because there's these like positive species that are competing with sugar maple. My theory, and I have to look into further, is it's probably things like American beech, which produce suckers, root suckers, which are really competitive with sugar maple. So it could be that you're seeing this negative relationship because when you're adding species, you're most likely to add species which are undesirable and competing heavily with sugar maple. And overall, we're seeing a negative relationship with the percentage of shrubs. So it appears that these shrubs are actually competing with small saplings and not having any sort of facilitative effect by increasing soil moisture or things like that. And a slight positive effect with large saplings in the plot. So we tend, if you see large saplings, you tend to see small saplings, where one's doing while the other is. That's kind of a way to think about that. And then finally, the map for large saplings, again, a really strong, clear, very similar to the small sapling spatial trend. And overall, these numbers are really low. This is, I mean, when you're thinking about this, this isn't even at the highest sites. If you've got about 7,000 saplings per hectare, that's not even 1 in every meter squared. And these were, again, saplings 0 to 2 inches DBH. And so very similar results as with the small saplings, a lot of the same associations, slightly different beta variables. But we're seeing the fewest in the northern lower peninsula and the most in the western upper peninsula. The deer effect is even stronger for these, so from going from 0 to 1, you would expect a 99% decline in the number of large saplings that you would predict for a site. Intermediate sites, site quality tended to do the best, and again, we had those negative relationships with canopy stems, density, and canopy richness in the plots. So kind of like thinking about all of these results together and what this implies for management. In general, sugar maple regeneration, you would expect to be on higher on sites with lower canopy density, where they have fewer deer and less shrub coverage. Those are kind of like the raw results. But overall, it really underscores the need for alternative management because these patterns are so strong spatially, and in many areas, the regeneration is just so absent or minimal that we really need alternative management to protect the long-term sustainability of these stands. And the Bayesian methods I found really allowed for incorporation of uncertainty, and it lended a lot more strength to our model where all of those beta values I didn't mention, but they were all significant, so it was finding relationships with all the variables. Future directions, moving beyond, we're going to have to do some coding on our own to move this model forward. We'd actually like to integrate the deer model and the vegetation model so that they run simultaneously as opposed to pulling out the best estimate from the deer model and plugging it into the vegetation model. And potentially assessing some nonlinear response functions in terms of once we assess the model fit. And we're also interested in making a binomial stocking model. So as opposed to just predicting how many stems you think you would have, kind of come up with some thresholds of how many stems do we really need to regenerate this forest, and then make a model where you're actually predicting how these factors would affect whether it's stocked or not, which I think would be a lot more useful to management. Because at some point, if you have enough sugar maple, you have enough sugar maple. Adding 10 more sugar maple per meter squared isn't going to make a difference. And much more results and interesting data will be coming out from the project at large. So I'd just like to acknowledge our DNR partners in this, the co-PIs on the overall project, Mike Walters and Gary Roloff, and many, many field and laboratory technicians that make this data collection possible. So does anyone have any questions?
So I just want to ask about the W term in some of the models. Is it a random effect or?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The W term is in the deer model. So the deer model has a spatial random effect.
Okay.
So it's, I used, I can look up the specific details, but basically assuming that you're using the sites around a specific site to infer what kind of density you would have, with closer sites being more important in making an estimated guess about density, and further sites are less important.
Okay. And also about the Poisson distribution that you use for the first ones, yes. Do you have like a hypothesis for the rate of change for the lambda? Or is it like a non-informed prior? What?
Oh, I used non-informative prior. So lambda is the estimated there's only one, so with a Poisson model, you only estimate
It's not.
this single lambda, so
Yes.
it's the mean, it's like what you would expect in terms of the count of stems. So, yeah, it
It's
was,
a big constant, so you expect that that doesn't say it's.
right, but there's not actually a prior on lambda, because lambda is informed by the linear equation, but the priors that I had on all the other parts of my model were not informative at this point, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So when it grows up in the future, how would it affect the regeneration?
That's a great question. I think probably one of the bigger things would be the effect of like changing snow patterns and water availability in the stands. Sugar maple tends to happen on mesic, more wet, not super wet, but like more wet and nutrient-rich sites. So I guess I would assume that we would see like shifts in where northern hardwood forests are most common or like occur and grow the best. Another thing that my lab colleague Evan is looking into is planting species like assisted migration. So yeah, I would say you would expect in some on the more marginal sites, especially with like the drier sites where we are having northern hardwoods, that they might not do very well. And then it's always a toss-up with how future invasive pests and pathogens might affect it. Overall, overall I would say it's hard to say. It's not something where we're expecting like huge changes. I think it would be like slow over time, kind of declines in quality. That's a great question though, something to think about more.
So my question is probably not something, a human dimensions question, but I wonder what it would be like if all of these are DNR properties, and assuming that, or most of them, and they're public, like what would, hunting or snowmobile populations do to deer usage if deer is really the biggest threat to these? And if we overlaid that, would that help explain like where deer are and when maybe? But it could be also very small. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is some research where they like look at like, I assume the Michigan DNR has like data on like density of like how many deer are hunted, and that's common in like the literature to look at like hunting rates as a method of improving the deer models. I think it would be like less. I would assume the pellet count data would be a better guess of deer usage, but it'd be interesting to look if like that is predicted at all by like I guess the number of licenses that they give out for
deer
deer.
tags.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if if that would scare the deer away, right? So that would enable more recruitment.
Oh, I see.
Record that. But
I don't think the hunting really makes like a significant dent in the population of deer. Yeah, I think it's pretty stable to me. But that's it'd be interesting to look into. Yeah.
Could you put up one of your slides with either of the two larger sapling classes? Awesome. So, if I understood right, when you said before from the Arbogast publication, you have some kind of threshold about what's stocked or understocked for these sapling classes. Is that correct? Did I understand that?
So the Arbogast guide only applies to canopy, so it's only
Okay.
2 inches and above.
Okay.
So this is all below that threshold, but within our lab, like some of the stuff Lucas Elenitzky did, have been looking through the literature to come up with like a stocked or not stocked.
So that came from you on.
Yeah.
So I was just curious if you could put these numbers in context, like where does that stocked, non-stocked threshold fall on that, like on your legend there, in terms of like how many of those stands are, or is this what you use for the in the introduction there?
Sorry, no, the introduction was canopy trees, so that
Okay.
was based off of Arbogast guide.
Yeah.
This here, I don't have a hard
Just curious.
number. I don't know, 5,000, is that kind of the?
For stocking that Lucas came up with?
Yeah, what was his?
It's about 900 and some per hectare.
900, okay. Yeah, so most of the ones, a lot of them are zeros, so like, but most of the ones that are kind of like larger,
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
stocked.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those large saplings, do those not include some old saplings in the mix too?
Yes, yeah.
It's- Might be an important point. So the small saplings don't include that, but the larger saplings include those young, thrifty saplings. Then some that are 50, 60 years old, they're less conventional, they've been there forever,
Yeah.
likely won't recruit. That's why the large sapling shoots up a little bit, I think, in some areas you would expect it. Do you think it's true, Catherine?
Yeah, I think a lot of the saplings are not very vigorous. So, yeah, and there's, you know, room within like determining what's stocked and not stocked. So, yeah.
Because you have the sizes scales continuously on your maps, right?
Yes, yeah.
That
It's a
anything that
continuous-
looks like it's less than 1,000 there is probably understocked.
Yes.
Can you walk through that exponentiated beta process for something other than year usage? Like,
Yeah, so,
I guess like the northern lower.
yeah, it's a little, and I could, so I had to pick like within the intercept for those categorical. One of those three categorical is included in the intercept, so I kind of went with the intermediate ones. So the Eastern UP is included in the intercept and the intermediate site quality. But basically, like, since it's a 0 or a 1 with categorical, as compared to, for example, like the Northern Lower Peninsula, compared to the Eastern UP, you would expect 45% or 55% fewer large saplings in the Northern Lower Peninsula. It's weird, but like when you think about it, since if you added 1, everything gets multiplied together. In that, plus you can kind of like when you exponentiate it, it's kind of that weird like things that were different. I don't know. It's kind of like math I took a long time ago, but it's one of the ways to think about it is multiplying it by a percentage as opposed to like saying it's 10 more saplings or something like that.
Okay, great.